Pleasure to be here. It's an especially great pleasure to be here on this platform because I'm sharing it with two graduates from Dalhousie Economics. And it's not just their contribution today that I'm proud of, but also there are many contributions to public life in Canada in their careers so far and on into the future. So it's just great to be here with Toby and Angella. That kind of made our division of labor a little bit easier because Manfred, who I think had me in his seminar class as a graduate student when I was an undergraduate at the London School of Economics, he assigned us roles which kind of fit together because governments tax, spend, regulate, and set the macroeconomic context for the labor market in which labor meets capital at the workplace, and that conditions so much of the rest of social and political life. So I'm going to be talking about something that I think doesn't get nearly enough attention, which is the macroeconomic context which governments set for the labor market as a whole, which conditions everything that happens at the level of the individual workplace. Toby is going to be talking about taxing, and Angella is going to be talking, I believe, about spending and social policy. And I think I can predict already that I'm going to agree with essentially everything they say. So that makes my job a little bit easier. And I want to start off with a certain historical context, not because I want to feed any tendency to nostalgia, but because I've been totally irritated over the last year or so by the number of media and also public sector documents which talk about Canada's current historic low level of unemployment. You know, we're at full employment. It's historically low. Well, it's only historically low if your memory ceases in like 1976. And there's a reason why people typically go for those particular numbers, because those are the numbers that are available online through the CanSIM database. You have to go back to the paper records to get Canada's unemployment rate from before 1976, but it was measured in essentially the same way. It's just that there was a major revision of the survey and it became much larger, but it's essentially the same concept. And that's it. That this I think is the pointer here. And the point I want to make is that Canada made a transition, a historic transition from a relatively low unemployment economy from 1946 up to about 1975, and then made a transition to an economy where throughout the 1980s the average unemployment rate was 8.5%, and it only came down somewhat since 2000 to the 7% range, and that average from 46 to 75 is inflated by this little period here, which went down in economic history as the Coin Affair, where we had a rogue governor of the Bank of Canada who raised interest rates dramatically and precipitated a big recession. And so we made this transition, and we moved from becoming a high unemployment economy. And like 43 years is long enough for amnesia to set in and for people to think that, hey, this is normal. This is the way labor markets are supposed to function. But there are lots of reasons why you would think that unemployment should be way lower now than it was in the immediate post-war period. For one thing, distance means a whole lot less. A lot of jobs are online. People can search for jobs on the internet. So search unemployment is way lower. We got people commuting from like Cape Breton to the oil patch in ways that you couldn't possibly do like 40 years ago. So there's a whole, the labor market is much less seasonal, both for structural reasons and for changes in technology. So there's been a whole bunch reasons. It's a much less generous unemployment insurance system, so any incentive effects should way be smaller. And most importantly of all, I mean, the Canadian labor force is now considerably older and way better educated than it was 30 and 40 years ago. It's like 26 percentage point gain in the percentage with a university education, and those are low unemployment types. So unemployment should be at least 2.5 percentage points lower than it was in the early 70s if we were going to get back to anything like the way things were. But Canada made a big shift to becoming a high unemployment economy. And the question is why, what are the implications, and kind of what can we do about it in the future? And I'm going to argue that it makes a huge difference whether jobs are chasing people or people are chasing jobs. That when the level of unemployment both reflects power dynamics in a society at a point in time and reinforces those power dynamics. And you can actually see it better than me. This is what so I'm going to have to look up here. So we used to have a macro policy setting where there was, and the Bank of Canada legislative mandate still reflects that, where there was a balancing of objectives. It wasn't just all about unemployment, it wasn't just all about inflation, it wasn't just all about budget balance, but there was some attempt for governments to balance off those different objectives. And through the late 70s and the early 1980s, there was a shift at senior government levels in Ottawa, not just in the Bank of Canada, but also in the Department of Finance, that what the Bank of Canada was to specialize in getting inflation under control, whatever it took. Finance was to specialize in balancing the current annual budget, and unemployment just dropped off the agenda. The level of unemployment is kind of a residual variable. It's supposed to come to the optimum once you've set a budget balance for the federal government and once you've stabilized inflation. So, I mean, in fact, a few years ago, when you use Acrobat documents, there's this search function. You can go and look for particular terms, and all the budget documents in the Bank of Canada reports are available online currently, so in PDF documents. So you can go to those documents and try and find the word unemployment. Find the word unemployed, and it just dropped out of the discourse. It's just not there as something that's mentioned. It became something that's kind of invisible in public policy discourse. But I think that unemployment is hugely important, and it's hugely important because it has a fundamental role to play in many aspects of social life, but especially in the determination of the rate of growth of wages, of which we've already heard a great deal. Now, when you don't care what happens to unemployment, that shifts power dramatically at the workplace. It contributes to the decline in unionization, and it contributes to the general level of insecurity that people feel. And so the product of all this was an increased level of inequality, insecurity, stagnation of real hourly wages, and perpetual cuts in what you can call the social wage of public services. All that tended to mean what we've talked about a lot today, that the gains with wages are stagnating at the middle part of the distribution, and if income per capita is still growing at very much its historic rates. Just a straight line trend explains GDP per capita from 1946 right through 2016. But if total wages are stagnating in the middle, but income is growing in total, and incomes are all essentially, most of the gains from growth are going at the top, well, income doesn't just stop at the top. It has to be either consumed or saved by the people who get it. And that increase in consumption generates unattainable consumption norms for everybody else in society to try to keep up. It's sort of trickle-down aspirations, but not trickle-down income. And that feeds increased anxieties and dissatisfaction throughout the distribution, very much fueled by advertising. But in addition, it creates the tendency to cyclical instability, because those savings at the top look for investment opportunities. Now, of course, if people are saving at the top and buying financial assets, there's always a flip side to a financial asset. It's a financial liability to somebody else. So the increase in financial assets at the top of the distribution is mirrored by the increasing debt of people in the middle part of the distribution. And that generates a tendency to increased cyclical instability. So let's go on to two interesting graphics, which are all about the relationship between the savings glut, the declining interest rates, and the increased instability. On this side, this is from the New York Times quite recently, and it just is for a whole bunch of countries, US, Britain, Sweden, Japan, Denmark, and Germany. And it portrays that a long-term decline in nominal interest rates, which is now negative in some countries. On the right-hand panel, we have an illustration from a recent paper in March this year by Larry Summers, who's already referred to as about as central an establishment a character as you get in the US economics agenda. And what he is trying to look at is the real interest rate, i.e. after inflation. And here is what it actually was. And here, the dotted line is what it would have been in the absence of government deficits. And that's all about how it has been the increase in public sector deficits which has kept the economy of advanced countries as a whole out of unfeasibly low levels of interest rates to generate economic activities. Public sector deficits have been absolutely central to whatever level of growth we've been able to achieve over the last few years, and particularly since the Great Recession. And of course, that idea of public sector budget balance on an annual basis was the mantra which drove many years of public sector decision making in Canada. So, I was originally going to title this talk Humpty's Future, on the idea of Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Because once you have a failure of a major paradigm, what is it that's going to replace it? I mean, I've always tried to stay away from the term neoliberalism, but it is useful shorthand for the idea that globalization, deregulation, labor market, flexibility, privatization, low inflation, fiscal austerity, they all add up together to a very coherent policy package. And the promised outcome was growth for all and an end to cyclical instability, and we all know how that turned out. So the thing is, zombies never completely die. You can blast holes in them all you want, but they still stagger upwards after a while. And so we can't really expect this intellectual framework to go away entirely, but it sure has unraveled a lot. Here's Larry Summers' defense of government deficits as necessary for the stability of modern economies. So, but it leaves in its wake a wreckage of political economy. Because one of the things that was true at one point in time was that we used to have established political parties in most countries which could kind of aggregate interests and present clear policy alternatives, but within pretty much a consensus norm of discourse, so that there was a pretty stable governance of liberal market economies. There wasn't a swing from 180 degrees from one regime to another, with one regime kind of trying to get rid of everything the regime before had instituted. So there's a lot of consensus making in decision making. We used to have bridging social capital, which aggregated contacts and ties, and we've separated very much into bonding little interest and identity groups. We've seen an outgrowth of, I don't actually like the word populism. I think it's more accurate to describe people like Trump, for example, as a xenophobic authoritarian rather than a populist. But we've seen the end of norm constraints and creeping authoritarianism and a decline of the institutions which used to sort of mediate international relations. And TINA here stands for there is no alternative, the famous phrase of Margaret Thatcher, but it's quite clear that there are major alternatives. It's just not clear which one's going to become dominant. Now, when we're thinking about the end of neoliberalism, there is part of it which has a deserved political constituency, which is the idea of racial and social and gender equality and tolerance, and the idea of civil liberties. And that's the question now, whether those also will be a casualty of the demise of economic neoliberalism. So, where am I at? Toby and Angella will talk about tax and spend. I would argue that macro policy sets the labor market context for the daily interactions of workers and firms, and that a worker's best friend is really a labor shortage. That gives people options. It means that they don't have to worry if they try to organize a union and run a risk of getting fired. It means that they can do something that fits with their life cycle needs for flexibility of labor or whatever. It also means that investing in the training of marginalized groups suddenly becomes an employer initiative, a way of not losing profits from lost production. It means that something like good daycare systems become employer priorities because that frees up labor that they can use to make more profits. So when jobs chase workers, many of the things that we think about as become so habituated to in the labor market over the last numbers of years, when unemployment Joe Stiglitz wrote an article in the 1970s which had the greatest of titles, because it said the whole article in just the title. It was called "Unemployment as a Worker Discipline Device," which I think, and after that, the whole article was just a riff on the title. So, tax and spend we'll be talking about later on. My particular favorites are to think about carbon fee and dividend, to think about a basic income guarantee, to have a high wage, minimum wage strategy. But I think that low unemployment and the accompanying political power of labor scarcity is a necessary condition for those tax and social policy changes. I also think that currently, at the level of interest rates that we're now sitting at, monetary policy has kind of run out of steam, and the only real way we get real macroeconomic stimulus is through increased public spending. This obviously means an increase in public sector deficits from one point to another, but that doesn't have to be a constraint on future generations. We don't want to confuse financial legacies with real legacies, because if that debt is internally held, for example, by the Bank of Canada, it is really not a constraint on future generations. So I'd leave you with the idea that fiscal stimulus is an essential ingredient that we shouldn't forget when we talk about fiscal stimulus, by which I mean public sector deficits, are essential to the context within which micro-level policies on the tax and spend side have to exist.